You are listening to the Hamingja Podcast, the renaissance of Western spirituality, paganism and animism. We show the Dharmic path and common origin of Norse, Germanic, Vedic, Greco-Roman, Celtic, Balto-Slavic and Persian beliefs. We also draw parallels to the Proto-Indo-European worldview and the ancient beliefs we call the religion with no name. The Hamingja Podcast weaves the threads together to understand where we come from and let our true nature empower us in everyday life. We don't have to turn to the east. The answers were always right here. We are all pagan by instinct. Welcome to the Hamingja Podcast. Last episode was an introduction to our steppe ancestors who migrated into Europe and Asia and brought with them their worldview and changed big parts of the world forever. If you haven't yet listened to that episode, I highly recommend you to do so you get the full picture of what this podcast is all about, the eternal spiritual way of our past, present and future. Today is about those who were already there from the beginning, because it wasn't really so simple that Europe was a desolate wasteland that these much talked about Indo-European peoples just rode into, populated when they needed it and filled it up with culture and worldview. The Indo-Europeans are our ancestors. Their DNA and mindset is deeply rooted within us. We should celebrate and honor them as often as we can. But there's also another important element in our genes and understanding of the world, a part of us worth bringing to light. Later pagan branches and world religions are a combination of the Proto-Indo-European religion and the beliefs of Mesolithic and Neolithic hunter-gatherers and early European farmers that already inhabited Europe. That's today's topic. First of all, very briefly, the so-called Western, Eastern and Scandinavian hunter-gatherers that we are talking about today is the distinct ancestral group of people that was roaming Europe at the arrival of the Indo-Europeans. Later on, a population of what we call early European farmers spread into Europe and displaced the hunter-gatherers, mainly in southern Europe. It is important to point out that even though I'll discuss the two parts of what constitutes pagan beliefs of today, the hunter-gatherers, early farmers and Indo-Europeans weren't very different genetically. It was basically the same people, but that had lived apart for tens of thousands of years after splitting up much earlier, and whose paths once again crossed. The difference was rather cultural, but as I'll stress from now on, spiritually quite alike. So even though the Proto-Indo-Europeans themselves genetically derived from hunter-gatherers, and so to say came back to Europe the other way around from the Eurasian steppe, it wouldn't be fair to talk about Western spirituality without also describing what was there already from the beginning. And even though the Indo-European culture conquered what is called Old Europe and displaced both people and worldview, we can't really talk about what grew from there on without also highlighting the already existing peoples and spirituality that in the other direction affected and influenced the Indo-Europeans, and in fact already had influenced them without them even knowing. At the time of the invasions of the steppe herders, Europe had already been full of people, culture and even agriculture, the cornerstone of civilization, for at least 40,000 years. And we know that those indigenous inhabitants of old Europe influenced the newcomers. In fact, the animism of the hunter-gatherers constitute the very foundation of all religion, sometimes called the first religion. Together with the Proto-Indo-European Dharmic path, it is true Western spirituality, and the most natural worldview for someone who feels connected to this earth. We're all pagan by instinct. So who were they, and how did they view the world around them? For thousands of years, the Indo-European tribes lived on the grasslands of present-day Ukraine and southern Russia. It's thought that climate change damaged the agricultural conditions on the huge Pontic Caspian steppe, and even though they were a people obsessed with transportation, it was rather this famine and lack of pastoral areas that became the prime mover for them, forcing them west and southwards. But it's important to remember that when the Indo-Europeans started moving, the party had already been going on for thousands and thousands of years in Europe. Spread out all over the European landmass were human settlements, from the British Isles in the west to the Carpathians in the east. There's been Homo sapiens in Europe for over 150,000 years, but these first dispersal attempts seem to have failed and been replaced by Neanderthal populations. We know that modern humans have lived in Europe for at least 40,000 years, all through the Paleolithic and Mesolithic periods. Paleolithic and Mesolithic Europe was a very different place compared to today. Vast, untamed landscapes extending over immense territories, relentlessly rising seas. It was cold and in fact not very forested until temperatures started rising, so it lacked coverage for people to hide while hunting. River valleys and valleys of all sorts, anything that channeled game and other animals into one focused location, was the perfect place to live. To survive, you must be intimately familiar with all plants and animals that roamed the landscape, every turn of the river, and be well adjusted to a life out in nature. And the people who could make it were the so-called Western, Eastern and Scandinavian hunter-gatherers of old Europe. They have contributed as ancestry to all modern Europeans. Western and Eastern hunter-gatherers are of the same descent, but with a slight difference that Western hunter-gatherers all had blue eyes but a bit darker skin, while Eastern hunter-gatherers had a lighter skin but browner eyes. The geographical border for these two groups went along the Danube River. The Scandinavian hunter-gatherers is a mix of the Western and Eastern groups. The hunter-gatherers of Europe were small groups of semi-nomadic people, around 10 or 12 adults plus children. The groups belonged to larger clans of up to 100 adults, spread over a wide area, and the members regarded themselves as the people. They harnessed the use of fire, developed intricate knowledge of plant life, and refined technology for hunting and domestic purposes. Initially, these people were living in caves and rock shelters spread out over their territory, moving seasonally, foraging for nuts, berries, and insects, following animal migrations, hunting for game, and fishing. The lifestyle required access to large areas of land to survive, which made permanent long-term settlements impractical. They therefore started building semi-permanent settlements within their territory and used mobility as a strategy. They didn't move until it was the peak time for gathering resources in another area. They were calculating in their movements and thus didn't have to be constantly searching for food and shelter. As a matter of fact, they weren't solely hunting and gathering, but had already domesticated some animals and were even growing wheat, making flour and baking bread. In many areas, large permanent or semi-permanent communities were located on the coasts, with smaller temporary hunting camps located further inland. They started building temporary wooden houses with sunken floors, which varied in outline from round to rectangular, and were built of clay and wooden posts around a central hearth. Permanent settlement and the use of domesticated animals, exchange and cultivated plants, and monumental tombs characterize a number of Mesolithic adaptations. With the transition from the Mesolithic period to the Neolithic, as the climate becomes warmer, very similar to that of today, the human attention shifts from stone to earth, the soil and the fruits of it. This, in its turn, gave rise to sedentary ways of life and the construction of permanent settlements, to the domestication of plants and animals. For at least 30,000 years, the hunter-gatherers had roamed their vast continent when suddenly more people headed towards Europe. These were who we today call the early European farmers. Up until then they had resided in the Levant and later Anatolia. They too had been hunter-gatherers, but had learned to cultivate new crops and tame livestock, and had become farming communities. They were now seeking new land to cultivate and spread northwest along the Aegean coastline and the Danube River. For various reasons, it's very popular among scholars to describe agriculture and sedentism as happening through a new people arriving from the Middle East and outcompeting European peoples. This is not the case. Archaeological evidence shows that there's a direct genetic link between the hunter-gatherers and the early European farmers. The farmers were in fact Western hunter-gatherers who had split up from the group already 43,000 years ago, stayed in the Levant and today's Turkey, and so to say come back to Europe, just like the Indo-Europeans we spoke about last time. The people already living in Europe and the newcomers had just lived separated for tens of thousands of years, but weren't really genetically different peoples. The farmers were rather descendants of the people they met now that they once again entered Europe. In Anatolia, the farmers had started growing wheat and domesticating aurochs. They were also the people that built the world's first temple, Göbekli Tepe. I'm sorry for my pronunciation. This was 12,000 years ago in what is today Turkey. 7,000 years later, they were also responsible for building Stonehenge in England. Over a period of a few thousand years, Europe's dark forests and Mesolithic hunting and gathering gave way to farming, sedentism, and fields of wheat and lentils. Agriculture not only ushered in a new economic model, but also brought about metal tools, new diets and new patterns of land use, as well as novel human relationships with nature and with one another. Up until recently, it's been thought that the Western and Eastern hunter-gatherers were outnumbered, chased off, killed, and had their culture outconquered by force. But new research shows that farming became commonplace because the indigenous population changed its subsistence strategy, rather than being overrun by incomers who brought the practice with them. The period with spread of agriculture has traditionally been viewed as a time of cultural stagnation, but new data demonstrate that this was a period of radical change and innovation. This was the period that witnessed the colonization of extensive new territory at high latitudes and high altitudes following post-glacial climatic change, the development of seafaring, and the synthesis of the technological, economic and social capabilities that underpinned the later development of agricultural and urban societies. And it wasn't a genetically different culture that replaced hunting-gathering. It was rather a spread of new ideas that transformed Europe. The hunter-gatherers saw opportunities, mixed with the newcomers, and basically married for money and know-how with people of their own descent, but who had lived separately for tens of thousands of years. And the economy and way of living changed. Up until 10,000 years ago, all humans practiced hunting-gathering. The people who lived in our part of the world were genetically the same, but in many ways fundamentally different from people of today. Their experience, worldview, and knowledge couldn't be further from ours. In our imagination, we can conjure up images of how these people might have looked or felt, but even some of the most basic elements of their existence or perception are hard to grasp. We know that at specific times of the year, these small family groups came together in the clan to socialize and for religious and ritual purposes. And we know that the early farmers had built cult sites and temples with monoliths adorned with lions, snakes, and swans. And it is this original European spirituality we're going to explore now. I'll show you that paganism and Indo-European spirituality is not a new element and separate from old Europe, but rather derives from it, is a prolongation of it. Let's keep it simple initially, and we'll go into the details after that. Let's just state that the world's oldest spirituality is animism. And the 7 most distinct traits describing the religiosity of pre-Indo-European Old Europe were animism, belief in an afterlife, ancestor worship, shamanism, high gods, and worship of ancestors or high gods who were active in human affairs. The European hunter-gatherers had an animist worldview before the Indo-Europeans arrived. But did the visitors really change all of that? Did they erase animism and later branches like Vedic, Greek, Roman and Germanic faiths consisted of new elements? Was the Dharmic path of the steppe herders really so essentially different from old Europe that we have to talk about 2 separate sets of beliefs? Animism derives from the Latin word anima, meaning spirit or life. That means that most things are animate, because they've had the breath of life blown into them. There is no human world and nature. There's no distinction between spiritual and physical realm. Everything is part of the divine and has spiritual essence. You have spirit. An animal has spirit, a river, a rock, a forest. All material phenomena have agency, meaning that the universe and the world is populated by spirits and agents with a will, the capacity to act and make free choices. Animists see the world around them as occupied by spirits performing magic. Magic happens because a spirit as a single agency wills it. Will is spirit. These spirits and agents can be interacted with, reasoned with, taken advantage of, and formed a relationship with. Animism is highly practical. Everything can and will interact with each other in one way or another. Everything is in relation to everything else. With rituals, you can communicate with and promote cooperation from the subject. It's all about creating a beneficial symbiotic relationship between everything and everyone that's animated. Life in Mesolithic and Neolithic Europe was extremely hard and demanding, a matter of life and death every day. We have already learned that people at that time didn't make a distinction between the material and spiritual world. The concept of religion as a separate element of life and culture would have been foreign to them. For them, the spiritual dimension infused all activities and all things. They had seen trees and plants grow and flourish after their seeds had fallen and found its way down in the ground. Therefore, naturally, they also put their dead family members in the ground, confident that one day they'd grow back up from the fertile soil. They had seen the seasons of the year come and go, and they had seen life and the earth give and take. Life was tough, and people had to be pragmatic. It was all about getting things done. Naturally then, spirituality was also pragmatic. It was about the circle of life and about collaborating with the forces of nature that surrounded you. To live a decent life, you had to be cunning about, understand, communicate with and influence your surroundings and everything that lived there. The human populations depended very much on the interaction with the natural world, infused with a variety of spiritual entities that could cause real effect on people. So it was pragmatic activities shaping the beliefs. Magic was to learn through practical experience what worked and what didn't. And they were for obvious reasons obsessed with animals, nature, the seasons, and the movement of the sun and the moon. Night or day, summer or winter, rain or drought, it mattered, and it had to be respected. They had seen rain falling from the sky, fertilizing the soil and creating life. They understood that without those wet gifts from heaven, there will be no food for the animals nor for us. They had of course also understood how children came into being, about the union between the male and the female aspects to create fertility. They realized that there's a connection between all of this. There's a fusion. And this is where we see the emergence of hieros gamos, the so-called very first religion, the holy marriage between heaven and earth. The male heaven penetrates the female earth, and life and spirit arises. This union later also came to be understood as the marriage between the material and spirit, between soul and cosmos. But to get, you have to give. You can't expect to receive all those blessings without actually putting something into it yourself. You can't expect to live without also giving life. Birth is a sacrifice, and even death is a sacrifice. The whole universe is built up on all things being eternally indebted to each other. So if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. This spiritual reciprocity, and also the union of Skyfather and Mother Earth, is also very present in Indo-European beliefs, as we'll see later. From petroglyphs and the oldest examples of graphic art, we know that obviously animals played a vital part for the spirituality of the hunter-gatherers. They also played a predominant role in the mental world. There was an intimate relationship between humans and animals that transcended and overcame the boundaries between different realms of being. There were close magical and religious ties of humans with animals. The hunters were begging for forgiveness from the game killed, performing oracles with animal bones and performing mimic animal dances and fertility rites to gain the powers of animals. Animals were thought to be man-like, to have souls, and to be equipped with magical powers. They could also be regarded as guardian spirits or alter egos. But what's even more clear in the images of old Europe is that they depict Earth's vitality and richness. The transformative processes of nature are symbolically manifested in sprouting seeds, eggs, caterpillars and butterflies, symbols of rising and spontaneous life as trees, springs and serpents, which seem to emerge from the Earth's womb. Sacred images represent both the miracle of birth, human, animal and plant, and the awe and mystery surrounding the cyclic destruction and regeneration of life. Most old European images symbolize the ever-changing nature of life on Earth, the constant and rhythmic interplay between creation and destruction, birth and death. Trinities of deities, rising, dying, and self-renewing. Life-giving deities are also death wielders. Male vegetation spirits also express life's transitional nature. They are born, come to maturity, and die as do plants. One of the most long-lasting types of ancestral worship are megalithic tombs. In ancient Europe, worshippers created giant burial tombs for the dead as a way to venerate the ancestors. The dead were adorned, covered in ochre, and continuously given offerings of food. The newly departed were buried alongside the long dead, for company and to connect old and new days. Many of the tombs were also built to resemble houses, indicating that the people of that time imagined their ancestors living on after death. Sacrifices and offerings to higher beings or to the dead appear as early as the Paleolithic period. Pits with offered bones have been found in the vicinity of burial sites. Most likely certain parts of the prey, such as the head and the meaty shanks, or at least the bones with brain and marrow, were sacrificed. It is assumed that they had a cultic or magical significance. The sinking of whole reindeer into lakes is also hard to explain other than as a sacrifice. The first people of old Europe used caves as sanctuaries where funerary and initiation rites and religious mysteries took place, and the best preserved monuments are megalithic tomb walls engraved with symbols and images of deities, stone stelae, and figurines associated with burials. But most of the corpus of information about the old European religion comes from shrines. They've been found as models within homes or standing free. They demonstrate the close connections between secular and sacred life. The 50 or more clay models of temples discovered so far allow us to see the workings of old Europe's shrines in striking detail. These shrines, generally small enough to be held in a person's hand, are usually found in front of or near the site of a former altar, and where they were probably gifts to the goddess of the temple. Cult objects, particularly figurines, provide clues to the types of rituals performed by old Europeans and the deities they worshipped. One of the most remarkable phenomenon was hoarding. Objects in large numbers were deliberately hidden in the ground or deposited in water in the form of a hoard. The objects were commonly placed in association with wet areas such as rivers, bogs and meadows, ranging from 2 to several hundred items. Also among the Indo-European peoples, it was common to sacrifice in pits. Small female figures, the so-called Venus statuettes, appear for the first time in the Upper Paleolithic period. In some cases they were schematically formed, and it is often difficult or impossible to recognize female attributes. In other cases, however, they are naturalistic representations of corpulent women whose secondary sexual characteristics were given special prominence, though their faces, feet, and arms were almost completely neglected. Such strong emphasis on the anatomical zones that are related to the bearing of children and nourishing them easily conveys the idea of female fertility. But the figures were also regarded as the representations of the abodes of spirits whose function was to help and protect, especially during hunting, but also for the family. That the preponderance of figurines found in old European shrines are female suggests that religious activities during this period were largely, if not exclusively, in the hands of women. Although men participated in religious ceremonies, it is women who are portrayed in the overwhelming majority of figurines as engaged in cult activities or as supervising these events from thrones. Furthermore, the rituals mirror daily secular tasks associated with women, most importantly preparation of bread from grains, manufacture of ceramics, and weaving. The old European evidence reveals clear-cut stereotypes of divinities that appear repeatedly throughout time and geography in sculptural art and figurines. The stereotypes include anthropomorphic deities and innumerable epiphanies in the form of birds, animals, insects, stones, and hills. Despite the multitude of culture groups in old Europe and the diverse styles of their artworks, the pantheon of deities was the same throughout the vast landmass. Judging by the stereotypes that recur in art and figurines, the religion of old Europe was polytheistic and dominated by female deities. I'll bring up and briefly explain some of the depicted deities. The Great Goddess was the primary goddess inherited from the Paleolithic. She is Mother Earth. Her functions included the gift of life and increase of material goods, death wielding and decrease, and regeneration. She was the absolute ruler of human, animal, and plant life, and the controller of lunar cycles and seasons. Many scholars claim that despite the multiplicity of goddesses, it's just the same great goddess manifesting in various shapes. Pairs of larger and smaller figurines known from all periods of old Europe represent both the major and minor aspects of the goddess, sometimes as a mother-daughter pair, which can be seen as an analogy to the later Indo-European Demeter and Persephone. Interestingly enough, the Rigvedic texts, written by Indo-Europeans, also bring up the goddess as the absolute reality. In the Devi Sukta, for example. The snake goddess has snake-like hands and feet and a long mouth and wears a crown. She is life energy incarnate. As a symbol of fertility and well-being of the family, she is worshipped in house shrines. In megalithic tomb shrines of Western Europe, the winding snake is a symbol of regeneration. The White Lady, or Death, is portrayed with folded arms tightly pressed to her bosom and with closed or tapering legs. She is most often masked. Her abnormally large pubic triangle is the center of attention. She dates back to the Upper Paleolithic and has been found throughout old Europe. Most of the White Ladies were recovered from graves and found singly, in threes, or in groups of 6 or 9. The pregnant or birth-giving goddess is portrayed naturalistically as a nude with hands placed on her enlarged belly. The abdominal part of her body is always emphasized. She's also depicted as a bulging mound and oven. In the infancy of agriculture, her pregnant belly was likened to the fertility of the fields. The pregnant goddess symbolizes both death and life, since the uterus can also be seen as a tomb. The birth-giving goddess is portrayed in a naturalistic pose of giving birth. The vulva, depicted alone, also served as a symbol for this goddess. When the Indo-European peoples came to Western Europe, they brought with them new technique, culture, and social structure. They obviously also brought their worldview. In many ways, their culture outconquered the indigenous and evidently still lives in and around us today, not the least the language I'm speaking right now. But I want to point out and highlight the fact that it wasn't just new things they brought. It wasn't just brand new and essentially different ideas they flooded Europe with. The Cultural Revolution might have been less extensive than what we think. When I utter words like sturgeon, shrimp, pea, bean, and turnip, you might think, why is he saying normal English words? As a matter of fact, I'm not. Studies show that the European languages are full of words that predate the Indo-European invasion. And they lived on within the new parlance. Pre-Indo-European lingo survived to our days. Local cultures influenced the new Indo-European language. Neolithic farmers made lasting contributions to Indo-European vocabulary before their own language went extinct, and to existential matters too. This episode is about explaining animism, the second part of what constitutes us, exposing our roots. It's also about showing that animism wasn't something that was here for a while and then ended with the newcomers from the steppes. Not only did it survive the confrontation, but it was already alive and immanent in what the Indo-Europeans brought along. Just like the words I just mentioned survived and were picked up by the Indo-Europeans, the swastika was actually used as a sun symbol in Europe already 15,000 years ago, and it was used continuously through the millennia and much, much later, also used by the Indo-Europeans. Did they steal it, or was it always there? And just like the Indo-Europeans already had DNA from the hunter-gatherers when they sort of came back to the West, they initially must have gotten their worldview from somewhere. I'll show you that our paganism has its DNA in animism. It evolved from ancient traditions of worship, of the elements of nature that served as a constant reminder of the highest ideal, the truth about nature and the nature of all existence. Already when defining animism and paganism, we see the similarities. I'll give you some examples. Animism is the belief that objects, places, and creatures all possess a distinct spiritual essence and personality and are worth honoring. It's an interaction with the world because everything within it's alive. A relationship to appease the gods, to maintain a harmony of all things. All pre-Christian European societies were animistic in their interaction with the spiritual realm and the invisible beings of the world. They were communicated with in a very practical way, either by people themselves or through a shaman. Paganism is the religious lifestyle centered on the celebration of nature. As such, it contends the relatedness of all things, with the gods and spirits living amongst us. Rituals in paganism are performed to represent the universe, the cycles of life, and the connectedness of all beings. Through such ritual, one transcends one's singularity in order to share a common existence, and the awareness of the participants' connection with the world is affirmed. Paganism is to see nature as a manifestation of divinity, the understanding of that life permeates everything and that everything is interconnected by the divine. It's also to acknowledge, worship, and live in accord with local deities, spirits, and sacred forces of nature. Just like in animism, the early pagans didn't worship in temples, but rather in nature, most often at a place that belonged to a deity or a spirit, like a mountain or river being a deity manifest. Others would describe paganism as a belief in polytheism, a concept of divine immanence and animism. Either way, the mystical trend within animism and paganism is the engagement and celebration of the all and the many, which are seen as inseparable. And when we look at both the Proto-Indo-European worldview and later expressions in the Indo-European branches, we see the kinship. The Proto-Indo-Europeans worship Mother Earth, the sun, the moon, dawn, daylight, etc. And most scholars claim that the Proto-Indo-European myths were basically explanations for natural phenomena, and that their rituals were attempts to manipulate nature and the universe to obtain their favors. The Rig Veda, the earliest of the Veda scriptures, is predominantly mentioning personified and deified natural phenomena, like Surya the sun, Prithvi the earth, Vayu the wind, Agni the fire, and Prajna the rain. Rivers like Saraswati were worshipped as a goddess with a capital G. According to the Devi Sukta I mentioned earlier in the Rig Veda, the goddess and all her aspects is the ultimate reality, just like in the hunter-gatherer world. The Vedic concept Dharma is the connectedness of all living things, and literally to uphold the balance. It is likely to have originated in and arisen from ancient animistic belief that all things are animated and belong to each other through the life force that permeates everything. If you listen to the Vedic sages, we should have love and respect for every living being, humans, animals, trees, for nature, for the earth herself. Why? Because no matter the external form, internally we are all Atman, we are all part of the divine. The so-called hieros gamos, the symbolism in that a marriage between the divine Mother Earth and Sky Father creates fertility and life, functioning as the axis mundi between them. It is considered the world's oldest religion. It existed already with the hunter-gatherers and is something animism and paganism have in common. The view that for the gifts of life we're given, we are indebted to nature and its spirits. In fact, the Hindu concepts of Shiva and his counterpart Shakti, the male Purusha and the female Prakriti, meeting as Lingam and Yoni to fertilize cosmos, describe the same phenomenon. The Indo-European Thracians of Bulgaria and Turkey developed a cult of the powers of nature. They revered sacred forests, trees, springs, and streams. An important strand of their beliefs was the cult of the Great Mother Goddess, which was associated with fertility and diversity. Magical acts and sacrifices were important elements of this cult for the nature. Healing rituals involving fire dancing games were associated with the cult of the sun. Thracians, Dacians and Scythians, like many other Indo-European peoples, were animistic and shamanistic. They communicated with nature and with the dead. Norse mythology naturally was influenced by the mythology and religion of their neighbours, the hunter-gatherer Finns and the present-day Sami people, whose shamanistic beliefs still echo in Norse traditions, shape-shifting into animal form and the world tree's central axis keeping up the natural balance. Two modern examples are the Japanese Shinto and the Calabash people of northern Pakistan. Shinto, meaning the way of the gods, is Japan's pre-Buddhist religion and is referred to as a form of animism. Just like in paganism, nature and its spirits are worshipped, but also gods such as the sun god, peace god and rice god. They often refer to the gods as the 8 million kami, meaning, of course, that all of nature is divine and that there's an endless amount of gods and spirits populating and permeating it. Often when the indigenous Indo-Aryan Kalash people of northern Pakistan is mentioned, they are said to practice a kind of animism, often equated with early Vedic religion. The Kalash are sometimes labelled animistic and sometimes as an ancient form of Hinduism, and it echoes many aspects of Rigvedic religion, worshipping nature and the gods therein. The Indo-Europeans are our ancestors and our heritage. We speak their languages, we use their inventions, and those of us who follow any of the pagan paths uphold the beliefs of the steppe herders who moved west. The Dharmic way once led from Ireland all the way to Japan. But there's been people in Europe for at least 40,000 years. And the hunter-gatherers and early farmers of old Europe are our ancestors too. A podcast about Western spirituality would neither be complete nor fair without highlighting their contribution. Their worldview is the origin of religion. It was never outconquered and forgotten. Not only did it survive to this day, but must have also formed the constitution of what was already inherent in the Indo-Europeans. For us to understand ourselves and keep the fire burning, we have to understand, recognize and connect to the different elements of our worldview. Strong roots make beautiful leaves. Ancient Indo-European religion was a complex animistic spirituality where nature was holy and places in nature had a genius loci. It was polytheistic and pantheistic. And just like the hunter-gatherers, they personified and deified forces of nature. Ancestor worship was a central component. Rituals and offerings appeased the gods and nature spirits to effect one's success. Hunter-gatherers were animists and also worshipped many gods, as we've seen in the figurines and statuettes. We've also noted that ancestors were fed, cared for and venerated. Both hunter-gatherers and Indo-Europeans claimed all things had spirit within. Spirits of nature, animals, elements and the cosmos. They saw spirit permeating everything. Spirit that could be communicated with and worth caring for to make life easier. It would be ignorant to say that the Indo-European worldview was new and essentially different from the indigenous peoples of old Europe. They indeed gave gods a higher status and depicted them differently. They also spent more time on refined rituals. But it's safe to say that animism is the origin of all religion, and Indo-European spirituality must have come from somewhere. It emerged out of animism, which is a key component of paganism. Just like they shared DNA, they also shared an understanding of the world around them. And even if one culture took over, they influenced each other, in vocabulary as in faith. Animism, together with the Proto-Indo-European Dharmic path, is true Western spirituality. And it is the most natural worldview for someone who feels connected to this earth. I want to thank you for listening. Make sure to subscribe so you increase your Hamingja straight away. You'll find more information about the podcast and the foundation on hamingja.foundation. You'll also find us on Instagram, Discord and YouTube, and more platforms will follow. Feel free to contact us if you have questions, requests or need guidance. I hope to hear from you soon and that you'll tune in next time. And until then, seek not the religion of your ancestors. Seek what your ancestors sought.